Welcome to Pop and Politics, a show that highlights trending political news and pop culture. Each week, the ladies get together like girlfriends do to chat about the biggest local and national news stories. They all have varying backgrounds and personalities. One thing they share in common is they all lean on the conservative end of the political spectrum. Meet the ladies. KJ. T. Xandria. Shelly E. Hanalyn. Smart, edgy, and conservative. This is Pop and Politics. Let's get started. Welcome. We are back, Pop and Politics. If you are watching on Facebook, please share this video and like this video, and also comment. We will be responding to your comments tonight, so please post a comment or post a question. We will be checking it periodically through the show. You are actually the fifth host with us tonight, so your comments will be addressed and shared. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, please take a moment and subscribe to our YouTube channel and also like this video. You have no idea what a difference that makes to ensure that our message gets viewed and resonates with people. All right, so tonight we are missing one host, T. She is away tonight. But again, we're bringing you another guest host, a special guest with us tonight. We are welcoming Dayvon Love. He is the Director of Public Policy for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle is a grassroots think tank which advances the public policy interests of Black people in Baltimore through youth leadership, development, political advocacy, and autonomous intellectual innovation. He is also the co-author of The Black Book, Reflections from the Baltimore Grassroots, a collection of essays that describe important issues facing grassroots activists and organizers in Baltimore. Welcome to Pop and Politics, Dayvon. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. We're happy to have you here. All right, so we are going to discuss the piece that you wrote and respond to what you have there in your contention that Baltimore's ills result from the economic monopoly of white-owned and controlled entities. So specifically, you were discussing the Baltimore Brew and the reporting that they do in Baltimore. But before we get into that, I do want to find out, how did you all come up with the name of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle? I love that name. I always have. And so I always wanted to ask you all, how do you came up with that name?
So many of us that are in Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, we say LBS sometimes for short. Many of us were high school and college policy debaters. Okay. So many of us met in college. And during that period of time, we were all, heavy listeners to Talib Kweli's Beautiful Struggle.
Okay.
So we kind of related to the album. And then there's also a Martin Luther King speech where he talks about, the beautiful struggle. So we just felt that it was, representative of our worldview in politics.
All right. Excellent. All right. So if you could describe for the viewers just a little bit about the piece you wrote in regards to the Baltimore Brew and the role they play in Baltimore.
Absolutely. So, one of the things about LBS that's important for folks to know in terms of our worldview and perspective, we're very clear that when you look at the kind of sociological data around quality of life, people of African descent, both the United States and around the world, that Black folks occupy the bottom of every index of quality of life expectancy, health, incarceration, all the metrics that one could use to measure quality of life. Black folks are at the bottom of. We attribute to the fact that our society is structured on the notion of racism and white supremacy. In every arena of civil society is structured in many ways by the collective interest of white folks and the institutions that then produce the kind of quality of life that allows them to essentially drive these major industries of our society. So we argue that that is ubiquitous. That is a part of how our society is structured.
Okay.
So given that, what we argue about the Baltimore Brew is this: is that as I'm sure folks are aware, there's been a lot of coverage of Nick and Marilyn Mosby, particularly the state's attorney Marilyn Mosby, and the argument we make about the Baltimore Brew is that they, in their reporting, emphasize notions of criminality in Black political life, such that it's rendered a natural part of Black civic and political life in such a way that then obscures focus on some of the more structural, some of the more impactful types of legalized, legitimized corruption that happens on a regular basis. And a part of why we felt it was important to make this argument, the Brew isn't exclusively an entity that perpetuates that, but in that surely contributed to that dynamic. And the reason we find that to be important is because the regular everyday lay person doesn't know about the Greater Baltimore Committee, right? They don't know about the structures of Democratic Party leadership that essentially run state and local politics. Folks aren't clear about the nonprofit sector and the way that it has political implications. Like there are a variety of ways in which resources are distributed and power is wielded. And then one of the people I mentioned is Bob Embry, who runs the Able Foundation. And I actually quote a book written in the early 2000s that talks about the level of power that he was able to wield from his seat as the president of Able, to essentially have much control over Black civic and political life. But because he sits in a position where he's president of a foundation, there's no means of holding him accountable, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
we put all the ills on Black elected officials. And I argue that we do need to hold Black elected officials accountable. So this is to say that we should ignore the kinds of corruption that we may see from Black elected officials. But the argument is that it should be proportional, right? That we shouldn't allow the focus on corruption of Black elected officials to obscure some of the more substantive kinds of normalized corruption that impacts people's regular everyday lives that folks don't get enough information about.
So let me, if we could. So I mean, you laid out a lot there. So let's just unpack just a little bit of that, Shelly.
Yes. Hi, Dayvon. Thanks for joining us. So,
Thank you.
in regards to that point right there, you were talking about in the Baltimore Brew article about the corruption. How are people supposed to evaluate, let's say, Nick or Marilyn Mosby or any Black politician, if, as you say, the whole society is based on a racist structure? It's ubiquitous. So what methods are we to use to evaluate politicians, even if they're Black, without being associated or called that we are, I guess, being racist?
Right. So the argument I'm making is more so about balance, right? That if we think about, again, I'll use the Greater Baltimore Committee as an example, right? Many of the policies that I've had to fight in the Maryland General Assembly and the State House, many of the policies that we've had to go against, many of them, the biggest cheerleaders for the Greater Baltimore Committee, right? So I'll take like mandatory minimums, right? So we've been fighting mandatory minimum sentences and sentence enhancements as an ineffective tool for public safety and as a policy that feeds mass incarceration, right? The Greater Baltimore Committee, which is an institution in Baltimore where the major business leaders meet and convene and advocate for policy that benefits them, that's an institution that plays a major role in Baltimore politics and
It
politics in
does.
the region. But there isn't much coverage of the activities of the Greater Baltimore Committee, even though they wield tremendous power. So the point I'm making is that we should evaluate what Black elected officials do. But in terms of the publications that get produced that are supposed to inform the citizenry of what's happening, we need to make sure that it isn't almost exclusively or mostly covering notions of Black political corruption, right? Again, which does happen, but that doesn't become the focus. Because if that becomes the focus, then the other ways in which corruption happens, as was quoted a few moments ago, the kind of white corporate monopoly that exists in Baltimore goes untouched. And the citizens deserve to know about that.
Hanalyn, did you have?
Well, yeah, kind of along with Shelly's point. So I understand you're saying you want there to be balance and that it shouldn't be focused on corruption of or wrongdoings or alleged wrongdoings of black politicians. But if you're looking at Baltimore City, and the Baltimore Brew is a local publication, and they're covering local politics, and the mayor is black, and the state's attorney is black, and the city council president is black, and the majority of city council is black, and the majority of the school board is black, and the CEO of the school board is black, and you say, well, you can't have an imbalance in covering problems or in criticizing, then you are in effect saying, well, you cannot criticize someone because they are black.
Well, yeah, I want to be really clear. So I'm not at all saying that, and I think it would be paternalistic to do anything but hold black elected officials accountable for the job that they get elected to do. So my argument isn't that we don't discuss it, right? I'm saying a couple of things. The first is that when we talk about politics, politics goes beyond just those that are in elected office, right? And so a part of what I'm arguing, and the Brew and other media outlets cover other things besides what elected officials do. So it's not unprecedented to ask that if media is going to properly represent the political landscape, that they cover forms of corruption that exist outside of notions of corruption of black elected officials or alleged corruption. So that's one thing. The other is that, when we talk about the importance of understanding, what happens in Baltimore City, and you mentioned like all the different, many of the different elected officials that are, black people. It's one thing to criticize policy, and that's important. What I'm talking specifically about, though, are narratives of criminality in political activity.
Give me an example. Can you give us an example?
So for instance, when we talk about Nick and Marilyn Mosby, there are a lot of detractors of Marilyn Mosby for whom they feel like she's not doing a satisfactory job of addressing public safety, right? There are people on the left who say that, and I've criticized, State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby, not reopening the case of Tyrone West, who was killed in 2013 by police officers. And so there are criticisms to be had. That's different, though, than a focus on criminality, and that much of the coverage is about trying to uncover criminal behavior.
But there is a Mosby's. Is that what you're saying?
But there is a federal investigation going on right now that is investigating criminal activity. So how do you cover that
proportionally?
How do you cover that in a way that you're saying you don't want the Brew to give the impression that there's criminal behavior, but they're covering federal subpoenas?
Right. Well, so using that as an example, so the criminal investigation, the federal investigation, that's a relatively recent development. A lot of the coverage that I'm talking about, precedes that, right? And there is a history, because it's important for folks to also know that federal investigations are also political, right? There are federal prosecutors that make careers off of going after elected officials. And in fact, there is a history, particularly in the federal government, of targeting black elected officials, really regardless of their ideology, right? You can read Dr. Tyrone Power's book. The name of the book is escaping me, but he is a former black FBI agent who actually documents the ways in which, when he worked for the FBI, there was a unit responsible specifically for targeting black elected officials. And so at his time, it was folks like Coleman Young, Marion Barry, and others, black elected officials. So there's a political element to it that, again, is not something that is talked about or described in its coverage. And what I'm saying is that
there was an incredible amount of corruption with Coleman Young. I mean, so again, where are you drawing the distinction between there are actual legitimate concerns to be looked into versus, well, they're only being looked into because of their skin color?
Right. What I'm saying is that, there's contestation over whether or not there's criminal activity, corruption from a variety of different political officials. What I'm saying is that what is also true, and that is not given nearly enough attention, is the way that, and this documentation of the way in which federal prosecutors and the FBI and other elements of, the kind of the federal government law enforcement, that there is a history of targeting black political figures and that information is important to balance it out, so that we're not saying, because again, there is as much there, we should expect that there is as much corruption amongst Black folks as there is anyone else. What I'm saying is that there's also important context, and that context that's important, that's often missing, is the way in which there is a politicization of the way that notions of Black criminality are peddled, and there are folks that make careers. So one example of this is that there's also a history. So let's just as an example, let's take Fred Hampton, right? He was the chairman of the Chicago chapter of Black Panther Party, right? And it is now common knowledge, it's now commonly accepted that law enforcement played a role in his assassination, right? And one of the things that they used in order to justify the raid of his house at 4 o'clock in the morning, that they used to justify his killing, was they used the media. They would leak things to the media, right? And use the media as a tool to justify and to get clearance from their higher ups to pursue their particular objectives. So again, I'm just giving additional context that I think is important for people to be informed about, so people can come to their own conclusions, but people have a balance of information so that people know, as they're assessing what they think about people who are, Black elected officials who are alleged to have engaged in misconduct, they also know that there is institutional pressure and momentum to try to criminalize Black elected officials, and that people should be equipped with all of that information.
So let me. Sorry. Go.
Well, we have to actually change gears a little bit. And I want to talk about what you said in the article. One of the quotes you said is white, but using the frame of corruption to characterize the thrust of Mosby's political activity is not only dangerous to their political futures, this is a continuation of a trend of rendering corruption as inherent to Black political activity, allowing legitimized white corruption to be normalized and acceptable. So my question is, what is the system of white supremacy in Baltimore? That is my question. And how does this system work that you advise of?
Yeah, very, very good question. And there are lots of different parts. I'll just give a few examples of how it operates. I already talked about the Greater Baltimore Committee, right? And so their primary objective is to push forward policy that helps to the bottom line of those big corporate entities. And if you think about the economic theory that often drives the Greater Baltimore Committee, they're about bringing more corporations to the city so that they can do better business. And the way that it's supposed to help Baltimoreans is the jobs that it produces. Most of the jobs that gets produced are service level jobs that don't produce the kind of wages that would benefit particularly folks out in the neighborhood. So that's one example of that. Or you think about, I talk a lot about, the Democratic Party establishment here in Baltimore and the state of Maryland, a Democratic Party establishment that will use notions of racial justice symbolically in ways to justify the status quo. So that's one example of how that operates. I mentioned in the article Bob Embry of the Able Foundation. I mentioned it earlier, but there are elements within philanthropy that are able to curate which Black voices are deemed legitimate in the political mainstream, right?
So let me stop you right there if I could. Did you have a question?
Go ahead. I want
to.
Okay. So it's interesting, Dayvon. First, let me say I've been going to your site, the LBS site, and I've been reading through some of your pieces, particularly the one When Baltimore Awakes. I've looked at a couple of your Malcolm X talks, and one of the things that I want to say as a compliment to you all is I appreciate the historical information and some of the bodies of knowledge that you all bring forth, some of the authors of times before. I appreciate that because it encourages me to go back and dig through and maybe read some of the writings, some of the historical pieces. But my question is, you just mentioned the Democrat Party, and one of the questions I have written down in regards to the When Baltimore Awakes Malcolm X talk and your writing here is that you argue on, I think it's on page 5 in the When Baltimore Awakes, you argue that Black people serve as meal tickets. And one of the things I wanted to ask you was, does this include the Democrat Party? Because the Democrat Party has about a 95, give or take 98% constituency consistently of Black voting.
So absolutely. So let me say a couple of things to that. The first is that I find that both major parties are extensions of the system of white supremacy, both Republican and Democrat. They just do so differently, right? They have different the particular interests. So Republicans tend to be oil, kind of traditional forms of energy, manufacturing. The Democratic Party tends to be high tech, Hollywood. So and that's a very rough kind of breakdown, but they're both extensions of systems of or extensions of white supremacy.
But wait a minute.
So
So how does that relate locally? Because we tend to
right.
talk nationally. How is that?
Hmm.
Because I'm still confused on how white supremacy uh, looks in Baltimore City.
Right. And so
Can
as it
I add
as it
on a
relates.
question to that, just before to give
Hmm.
you just an addendum to that before you answer?
Hmm.
Do you believe, because so we've had consistently for decades black mayors, black city council presidents, do you believe that in Baltimore City that any of these black elected officials going back for decades have any agency and any power?
So addressing the first question first, the way that it looks in Baltimore, and the reason we talk so much about the Democratic Party is because it's the party that's in control in Baltimore and statewide. And one of the ways that the Democratic Party perpetuates white supremacy is that there's an industry where black suffering is commodified. And the commodification of black suffering is often used as meal tickets to justify institutions for whom they say their purpose is to serve our community, but it's what I call disaster management, right? So when you look at, for instance, many of the social programs that are often funded, many of them are merely designed to manage the kind of oppression and suffering of black folks and not to empower, not to help build institutions so folks can be self-sufficient and be
Okay,
I
independent,
agree with that.
right?
Yeah.
And so that's one of the ways that that liberals and the Democratic Party in particular perpetuate the notion of white supremacy, and so there's a form of dependence that it
Well,
that it
we agree with
cultivates.
that.
Yeah,
I was
we agree
gonna
with
say,
that.
I actually. Oh, sorry. Hold on. Let me fix this.
Yeah, we agree with
So
that.
So there's a form.
while Xandria is getting untangled here, if we all agree with you with that point you just made, Dayvon, I guess I would ask, why don't more people in Baltimore City know that? And when you have people who are on the conservative side or the Republican side bring these issues and these points to fore, we are consistently, bashed down. But you're saying the same thing that we would say, at least on this point.
Right. It's one of the interesting ways in which it's an interesting kind of convergence, right? I've because I do a lot of legislative advocacy, particularly in Annapolis, but also locally. I've seen in the legislature Republicans make arguments that are similar to our perspective, but they get there differently, and how people get there matters. So what I mean, let me give you an example of what I mean, and then I'm gonna come to the question, that was asked about black politicians. So, Republicans will say things like, we need to look at the family, right? And that's something that I think is generally true. The question, though, is how we get to how we come to that conclusion. Because unfortunately, I think many Republicans, the way they come to that conclusion is through notions of inherent black pathology, right? That black people have a culture that is toxic, that is, antisocial, as opposed to understanding that the larger system of white supremacy, right, has created an environment that if any other people were exposed to the level of dehumanization that people of African descent have faced, and if folks understood the scope of it, then the kinds of behaviors that we see in the black community in terms of violence and other forms of violence, etc., that is something that is produced in a context where there is scarcity, where there are mass incarceration, where there are all these other ills. And so I think a part of why sometimes people get pushed back when they bring up things like the family is the question of how you come to that conclusion. And I've heard folks so that's one piece. So let me get to the question
so
around.
let me just say this real quick. So you're saying then that conservatives or Republicans believe that the family has pretty much disappeared or is not supported in black communities because it's something inherent in black people.
Exactly.
But
Right.
but we all understand, like, see, okay, that's where I disagree a little bit. But I do want to say, first of all, like, you are a very likable person. You know, the same thing as I was like reading through a lot of your stuff. There were areas where I was like, hey, I agree with his views about Baltimore as pertains to the white liberal party, because that's kind of where I see it. I saw, I think it was a January 24th interview you had with the Real News Network, and somebody asked you, like, if Martin Luther King Jr. was alive today, right, what would he think of what's going on? And you had mentioned essentially that you thought that a lot of the things that the Liberal Party was pushing, right, it kind of was that sense of like, hey, we're gonna jump on this because it looks like we care, but we don't really care. So
It's just pandering.
right, pandering, exactly.
Right.
But can we get back to that
but getting
point?
to the other
Yeah.
point, I mean, we understand the way that this country's history created challenges in the future. So my only thing is, I think there's too much weight put on this. Systemic racism is constantly the reason that, you know, that blacks face challenges in America, because while in decades past, right, it was more prevalent, now in our generation particularly, and all the generations to come, for instance, like, we're even seeing less and less people born of one ethnicity. Everybody's multiracial. So I think there's an understanding around our history. I don't think that it's really continuing to trickle down in the ways that it did 2 decades ago.
And can I just say,
Let me say a couple of things to that, and then I do want to get to the other question that was asked. The first is that one of the other places where there's convergence between, you know, my argument and conservatives is that what we believe is that there need to be investment in infrastructure, like human and organizational infrastructure within the black community to solve our own problems. Oftentimes what happens is that the solutions to black people's problems are imposed on us by white-led, you know, institutions, people who see themselves as knowing our communities better than we know ourselves. And one of the things that I often encourage conservatives to do who talk about, because a lot of times what happens, we talk about police brutality and folks will bring up, well, black on black crime. And one of the things that I encourage conservatives to do who bring that up is to say, if that's important, then help us raise money and awareness for organizations that are in the community who are doing the work of trying to fight against violence in our communities, as opposed to saying that we shouldn't focus on police brutality and focus on, because there are lots of people in the community who are doing that. Second thing I'll say is that on the notion of the way that white supremacy operates. So there's the structural piece, but there's also this, is that we live in a society where the propaganda, the things, the images, the narratives that are consistently and highly circulated are of notions of, you know, black inferiority and black pathology. I'll give you an example. You know, very few people have been exposed to narratives of people of African descent operating at what we would mark as high levels of civilization. When I was younger, I was coaching debate at a high school, and I had a teacher say to me, you know, Africans, you know, traveled across the Atlantic Ocean before Europeans did. And my first, you know, reaction was, you know, why do we always have to have these conspiracy theories? Like, you know, it's not that big of a deal, et cetera, et cetera. A few months later, I come across a YouTube video that was entitled They Came Before Columbus. It was a lecture by Ivan Van Sertima. He wrote a book called They Came Before Columbus. I read the book. And there are two things that became clear to me after reading that book. The first was that Africans were traveling, you know, doing navigation around the world. In fact, you know, many of us learned in elementary school that everyone thought the world was flat. Well, Europeans were some of the only people in the world who thought that. The Moors had been doing navigational stuff for centuries. But the second thing that I asked myself, why was I so willing to be dismissive of that? And the answer that I came to was, I had never been exposed to notions of people of African descent operating at something that is marked as high levels of civilization. I had not been consistently exposed to those narratives. So it was unbelievable to me as a Black person to imagine that level of technological advancement prior to the intervention of Europe into the world. And so those are notions. And so we live in a society where the notions of white supremacy are actually rational beliefs given the kind of information that is made available to the public. So a part of what we also have to do is many of us have to learn not just about the structural racism that exists in our society, but also learn about the ways in which peoples of African descent have been innovative at solving human problems, such that then peoples, whether it's people of African descent or others, can contribute to the self-determination I think is necessary. On the question of the Black political officials, as I mentioned earlier, the white economic monopoly in Baltimore, and it's true around the country, is such that if you're a if you're a Black person trying to get elected, that there's certain networks that you have to be proximate to, right? So either you join the Young Democrats, you might then do the GBC's leadership program. You might be, join a fellowship of a major philanthropic institution. And what is happening is that those institutions are curating which Black elected officials are viable for public office. Supplement that with the fact that the majority of those who are eligible to vote do not participate. And so what you have is particularly in Baltimore and in Maryland, a Democratic Party that actually has not expressed much interest in more massive voter turnout. Because a part of how the folks who control the party maintain their power is being able to curate who's able to come to power in the party. And so many of the Black elected officials are not people that were chosen by our community. These are people who were individually ambitious, knew what route to take, and so what we get are what's available to us. And so a part of what LBS has argued and advocated for is that we need to do the work of developing independent Black electoral infrastructure that is more accountable to the masses of Black people, that is more accountable to people who've been traditionally turned off by the political process, so that we can elect candidates that are more representative of our interests and not merely people who have been able to navigate white corporate interests to get the platform to even run for office.
I agree. Oh, I actually think there's a lot of common ground because, like you said, there are so many areas where conservatives agree, coming from our perspective and the principles that conservatives value, and the outcomes that we want. That we want to see Black economic development and empowerment and agency, and a better understanding of history. I think, like what you were talking about, the stories that you were saying that you had never learned in school. I think that there is such a disservice that's done in the way that history is taught in schools anyway, in world history. And there is a very, a myopic and a Eurocentric viewpoint that things are taught about, even in terms of slavery. We had talked a couple of weeks ago about, even in the reparations discussion, where it's not even the full history of slavery across the globe is not known. So I think that the education system really does a grave disservice to students, to both Black and white and any other ethnicity, because we're not putting things in a broader context. But I do, and I take a lot of your points. I think like your points are resonating with a lot of us about the criticisms of this kind of mindset within the local politics in Baltimore City, where people are really just kind of stuck in this rut of just voting for the same thing, and they're not questioning and they're not challenging the system and the status quo and the Democratic leadership that has had this stranglehold on the city, for 100 years. I disagree then where you're applying it to the Mosbys, saying that Marilyn Mosby's, I know in your article you talked about her almost as like a transformative figure fighting against the system because she comes from this. Oh, but
that's not what I said.
Oh,
what I
that
say
she was challenging, that she's being attacked because she's challenging.
That's not what I said. So what I said in the piece is that, as I mentioned, Black elected officials are often straddling the line between establishment white corporate support and the Black community. So they're usually having to straddle those lines. What Marilyn Mosby has been able to do, and to some extent Nick Mosby, is that they've been able to develop an enthusiastic base of support amongst working class Black people. So they're not as reliant as many other Black elected officials for kind of establishment white economic corporate support.
Well, the point that I was just going to make with Mosby, I just want to make the point is, that a lot of the funding for these trips that have been investigated through fair and just prosecution, the funding that traces back to George Soros and the Open Society, the funding through these other dark money organizations that have been funding her travel and that have been funding these symposiums and seminars that she's been going to and have made contributions to her campaign. So she's not free from the control of these white leftist organizations that are pushing their own agenda and using her as kind of the figurehead or the cat's paw in Baltimore in order to do that.
And I would like to just add to Hanalyn's point, Nick or Marilyn Mosby, maybe Marilyn to a larger extent, even though she is sort of straddling the fence, as you say, how have her policies, or what policies has she put forth that have benefited Baltimoreans? Because that's, to me, where it comes down to, the nitty gritty, and Nick Mosby for that matter. What have they done that actually helps the city?
Right. I mean, I think their record is mixed. One of the things that we worked on with State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby is a piece of legislation in 2019 that vacated the charges of those who are incarcerated for the testimony of corrupt police officers. You remember the Gun Trace Task Force, federal investigation and corrupt police officers. So we worked together to pass a piece of legislation that allowed, people who are innocent, who were, in jail because of corrupt testimony from police officers, to be released. We worked on, she was a part of the work around police accountability this past legislative session. So those are some of the things that we've worked on together, right, and that we've collaborated on. But as I say, and as I mentioned in the piece, there are things to criticize Marilyn Mosby for, right? And that's a part of why, one of the things that's happened since I put the post up is that there's some folks who wanted to make the debate about whether or not I or LBS or others should or shouldn't support Nick and Marilyn Mosby. And the point that I'm simply making is that what has happened is that Marilyn Mosby in particular has been able to cultivate a emphatic base of support for a variety of reasons.
But what Democratic politician in Baltimore doesn't have this support, though? I mean, I don't know, even Sheila Dixon, Pugh, any of these Democratic politicians that have been accused of some type of corruption or fraud, and again, I'm not saying that the Mosbys did anything, but accused of any type of mishandling, they always get support from everybody.
And they get support a lot of the time because of this loyalty, because there's a fundamental feeling of loyalty, and you can't challenge. And that's kind of speaks to your criticism about how the Democrat Party plays on that and doesn't offer any meaningful solutions, and just plays on the fact that people feel like they have someone in power who represents them merely because they look like them, whether or not they're actually doing anything beneficial for the community or not.
I would say it a little bit differently. I would say this: there are two elements. One is that there are enough Black folks that understand some of the history that I mentioned earlier about how Black elected officials are targeted, but a lot of white officials are not, right? And so I think there are enough people that recognize that it becomes something that for a lot of people is obvious, even if they don't know all of the history. So that's one piece.
But when you say that, I mean, I don't understand how that is mattering. It matters in Baltimore when we haven't had many white officials. How is that mindset and that thinking actually happening manifesting here in Baltimore?
Right, because what I'm saying, as I mentioned earlier, is that political life extends beyond just those who are elected to public office. And as I mentioned earlier, many of those that are able to ascend, Black folks that are able to ascend to public office, ascend because of the way in which they're curated. There's certain pipelines that in order to get elected, they go through. Those aren't pipelines we control as a community.
So right? Should they not follow up, or should they not accept that curation?
Right. I would argue they should not. My argument has been that we need to build a level of independent grassroots civic political infrastructure so that we don't need those institutions. But the other thing I also want to say is that there's some Black elected officials who are more reliant on their support from Black folks than others, right? And so if we take the last mayoral election, for instance, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but Sheila Dixon, the majority of her base was Black. The current mayor, Brandon Scott, his base, the folks who voted for him, was way more mixed demographically, right? And and that matters. The reason that it matters is because those forces that like to curate, those Black political voices that are viable, if a person doesn't need them as much, then that is a threat to their ability to continue to curate who's able to ascend to public office. So this doesn't mean that Marilyn Mosby, I'm not making the argument that Marilyn Mosby necessarily is a champion for, revolution, Pan-African, political change. What I'm saying is that I'm pointing out a dynamic where Black political figures who are less reliant on establishment figures. Now, they're all straddling this fence that I characterized earlier, but those who are less reliant on those establishment forces are the ones that are more likely to be challenged and criminalized. And the impact that it has is that it serves to then discourage the ascendance of Black political power. Because if Black political power is criminalized, right, then it's harder, I think, for those to understand the importance of building independent Black beachheads that are not reliant on those corporate forces that do this work of curating who gets to have a platform.
So in other words, you're saying we need a Black Trump. I'm joking.
Not saying that. Not saying
Because
that.
he wasn't relying on it.
We need a Eugene Boycott.
No, I'm joking. All right, we are coming to the end of our time. Yeah. Did you want to have any? Because I know you both.
Well, I think, I guess just as there's closing remarks. I mean, again, like there's been a lot of agreement, and I think that our goals are the same. And I share actually your criticism of and I share your criticism and your kind of distrust of the Republican Party, because I came from the same place. We all did. Because we all felt
Democrats at one time.
and because I felt like there was something that was lacking. There was a way that white conservatives in particular, that they would talk about problems that were affecting Black communities, like fatherlessness, which we know is so inherently tied to poverty and crime rates and education. And when you talk about corporations wanting to bring in this, these business groups wanting to bring in corporations to Baltimore, but they're not hiring people from the city. When you have an education system that is not educating people and graduating citizens who have marketable skills, then that's what you're left with. So, or they aren't eligible for anything other than the entry-level jobs. And so you have all of these issues, and I think that there has been for too long a problem within the establishment ossified Republican Party, where they were just kind of talking at or preaching at Black people, and it does come across as whereas you're kind of condemning Black people for some kind of inherent pathology, like you mentioned, as opposed to saying, look, these things are not working, these policies from the left are not working, and they are keeping people trapped in a cycle of poverty and crime, and we care about you as citizens and want to see something better.
I guess my last question, I have many, but I know we're short on time. But I guess one of the last questions I would ask is, how do Black people, particularly in Baltimore, or what would LBS suggest are good economic strategies, or strategies in general, for a Black healthy Black life?
So if we're talking about economics, one of the things that I think is important to focus on is the ability for Black folks to engage in collective wealth accumulation activity. And so I think that comes from, investing both in, Black, not just Black business, but Black businesses that have a commitment to investing in the community, investing in cooperatives, and things like worker-owned cooperatives that can both allow folks the ability to experience ownership of something that they're working for, of an institution they're working for. I think it's important for us to look at the contracts that public contracts that are given out, and to make it so that there are more contracts given to Black companies and cooperatives that are able to employ more folks from our community. I think what we have today is a system that focuses almost entirely on jobs, which is helpful, but not enough on building wealth.
And to that, Dayvon, I would say one of the problems is in the city, Baltimore City, it is cost prohibitive to even start a business for a lot of people. So I think that economic education, that economic well-being, those are important. That's an important piece to this whole thing. Even I think it's more important than the racial or the structural racism that LBS talks about, because this is where Black people live. They need to, we collectively need to understand how to build wealth, not just an income, but wealth for generations.
Right. And the only thing I would add to that is build wealth in a way that lifts the entire community. Because I think one of the mistakes that has been made in the past, there were efforts to try, when you look at the minority set-asides, you know, Parham Mitchell, first Black person to represent Maryland in the House of Representatives, one of his signature pieces of legislation were the minority set-asides that set aside a percentage of federal contracts to what was supposed to target Black contractors. And a part of what has happened, unfortunately, is that there have been some Black folks that have benefited from that. But those Black folks, I think, have not done their duty in making sure that that wealth can help benefit the collective of our community, that individuals benefited and not the masses of our people. And so I would want us, when we talk about building wealth in ways that lifts the entire community and not just a select group of individuals.
Well, on that note, I'll end it there. One thing I would challenge you to do is to reach out or try to connect with some of the Black Republicans that have run in the city, if you haven't already, because everything you are saying, we have been talking about amongst ourselves with the candidates. We are actually kind of, I think, the grassroots Black people and that are working and striving to make change within the city, and we don't have anybody backing us up. You know,
we are the ones fighting against the system in Baltimore City.
So you don't have to worry about any type of companies and the whites because nobody. We funded our own stuff.
Although we are accepting sponsors.
We are literally grassroots. We are literally the grassroots.
I was gonna say the same. You know, when I read your article, I'm not gonna lie. As I read it, it sounded, I don't want to say, not the word radical, but just a little bit more angled, I guess, a little bit more, I don't know, very Black versus white, you know. But I think, as I read it, but I did notice there were a lot of areas that we have a lot of common ground, and the same thing that I echoed, you know, hey, maybe we'll all collaborate on a project. Because, I do think we all, everything that you mentioned, like we really have aligned views on it. Maybe slightly different angles in some areas. There's other topics we could go into where I'd be curious to hear your view on them. Like, I don't even know if I should mention it because we'll spin off, but things like reparations
we have similar
all
goals.
of that. Yeah, but we do have similar goals at the end of the day. So.
Right. All right. Well, is there anything you'd like to share? Any initiatives or anything you have coming up that you would like to share before you go?
Well, let me first just, thank you all for the invitation. One of the things that, I like to see is, coming to places where there's diversity of thought. So I really do appreciate the opportunity to, have the conversation and go back and forth, healthy dialogue. In terms of things that we're working on, one of the major initiatives is the Black Arts and Entertainment District work that we've been doing. And so we encourage, there's actually a Black Artist Fair that's coming up April 30th through May 1st, I believe, or May 2nd. And so, we encourage people to go. You can find it. There's LBS's website, lbsbaltimore.com, and all the relevant social media. And there you'll be able to find some of the advertisements of the work of the Black Arts District. That goes right in line with what we were just talking about in terms of Black economic empowerment. Part of the rationale for kind of bringing up and helping to institutionalize the historic Black Arts and Entertainment District of Pennsylvania Avenue is around that idea of like Black economic uplift. And so we hope you and your listeners will, avail yourselves the opportunity to experience the Black Artist Fair.
All right.
I actually signed the petition for that when Lady Breon was first working on it.
Thank you.
All right, sounds good. Yep.
Thanks for coming.
Right.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. You definitely got to come back again because we can have this probably all night long.
Absolutely.
So, again, thank you. Dayvon Love with Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle.
Yeah, you all take care.
All right, you too.
All right.
All right. So, great segment.
Yeah, that was actually, I think that was really worthwhile to hear where he was coming from and to give him a chance to really to expound on some of those views. Yeah, I mean, like you said, we don't agree on everything in terms of the approach that he's coming from. I think there's too much of a focus on this kind of white boogeyman that's out there pulling the strings. That's why I asked that question. Do you believe that any of these black politicians have their own agency to make change? Because I just think when you keep telling people you have no control, that becomes it's a self-defeating narrative.
Right.
Yeah, and I agree with what he said about how the corporations have so much impact on. I mean, look at Facebooks and the Amazons of the world. I mean, and in Baltimore, of course, as well. There's corporations that back all the politicians. That's who funds campaigns. That's sometimes why it's hard to get things done. Because all these private companies are kind of kicked out of the loop. When you know what I mean. Like there's so many things that a private companies can have an impact on for a good cost, very low cost to citizens and the residents in Baltimore, and essentially corporations get in the way.
Yeah, not only that, but I mean about the media structure. I mean, if you think about, he was saying Baltimore Brew, but look at CNN this week when they came out and said, my God, they were on video talking about how they were trying to shape the national debate
in the Trump election.
In the election, right? I mean, they basically came out and said what they're doing to push up Biden and what they were doing to
it's
get out Trump.
Agitprop. Just like the time aren't informed. Citizenry is not informed.
Right, and people literally live by watching CNN. They think it's the straight arrow, non-biased, and they literally said what they were doing.
I would argue with my Republican boss years ago about CNN and NPR, and he said, those leftist, media corporations. I was like, those are objective news sources. I don't know what you're. And now I'm going, oh my God, they're so funny.
Time Magazine did that after the election. They came out with that piece of how the cabal, or what, I forget what the title was. That piece of how these people basically set out to undermine the election. So this is not new.
And they were celebrated for that.
Yes.
Because they were preserving democracy by getting rid of Trump and undermining the will of the people. Serving democracy. Anyway.
I enjoyed having Dayvon.
Good. Because we were like, we gonna put it on. Boxing gloves.
Look, I got all my boxing on last night, so another interview.
Yeah, so I didn't even put any powder on because I was like, am I gonna be sweating because it's gonna be so contentious?
No.
But
I didn't think it would be contentious because I've been watching a lot of their videos and their talks, and he comes across as very
nice, very
very likable, very presentable, and I know that might people. Why is she saying that about a black man? No, his demeanor. It comes across as approachable. As approachable.
Yeah. So
somebody that you could disagree with, but still
and a lot of our values. A lot of our
not
values
sitting there
align.
like this. What we had last night.
And who does that? That's one of Mosby's signature looks.
Oh, I wasn't even talking about that.
I was gonna say I think a lot of us here take issue with some of the older conservative notions, which is why we're all kind of in the middle.
Messaging. The problem with the messaging, and that's why this new Republican brand is so important, because we need to be able to reach people who have those concerns and to show them like this is what the conservative value is.
Yeah, I totally agree. So, we did go a little long in the beginning, so we have time for one additional topic.
That's fine.
So,
good conversations. You can't,
right.
Something funny or light. I don't know.
Oh, we could do the share.
Yeah,
whatever. We had a lot
light.
of
Something light.
Yeah, we could do something light. So we'll go right into our coverage of, if you guys have been following, we talked about the Cheryl Underwood and on the reel with Cheryl.
The talk.
Was it the talk or the reel?
The talk.
The talk. Okay.
Yeah.
So just to give you guys some background, Cheryl Underwood came out this week saying she experienced PTSD.
Oh, Lord.
That she still got a job, but she experiencing PTSD after Sharon Osbourne fight on the talk. So she says that preceding Sharon Osbourne's exit, Underwood revealed Monday on the show's first episode since its nearly month-long hiatus that she is suffering from trauma.
And what I said to you was, it sounds like Z Cohen needs to offer her a role in Trauma Task Force. Everyone's got trauma. Everything is PTSD.
GMAFB. Give me an effing break. That's what I said. Because I'm sorry, honey. This is ridiculous. I mean, if everything is traumatic, then nothing really is.
A paper cut is traumatic. Everything is PTSD.
Well, right now it seems like we are digressing as a people. It's just like everyone is. I remember my mom's generation. I mean, my mom was hardcore. Like, you really had to. She wasn't crying over anything. But now it's like everybody's a bully. You know, and now she's suffering from trauma.
Everyone needs safe spaces.
You had so many more struggles. I mean, life is so
in the second interview.
easy compared to.
She said that.
When they had they had like a follow up on the talk.
They had a therapy session. Did you see that?
Therapy session, right.
With a doctor.
And they were asking
Did you
her.
see it?
Oh my, no,
right,
I
and she
didn't
said,
see
well,
it.
this is a safe space. Okay, first of all, anytime people say something's a safe space, it is not a safe space.
You kind of lose me halfway. At least you're halfway to the
Second of all, like, they had 11 years of friendship.
Yes.
So, and I was watching this other thing where, I don't remember who interviewed Sharon, but essentially she was expressing that they had this code amongst themselves because they had an incident in the past where so typically they all, I guess, knew the questions in advance so that they could prepare. And they had a situation in the past where some sort of question was asked that was not in the script ahead of time, or the person didn't know that it was directed to, and it kind of blindsided her. And I think it had to do with race, something related to race. So it was like a touchy subject, right? And after that, the girl was so upset that they agreed that going forward, we're always gonna share the topics before we discuss. So during this interview, the questions that they asked Sharon were not discussed ahead of time. So she felt like she was set up.
It was an attack.
Yeah, and Cheryl, their names are so similar.
Oh, Cheryl, the question Cheryl had for Sharon.
Cheryl had for Sharon, was provided by the executive producers for her to ask Sharon, and Sharon never knew of it ahead of time.
They set that up to pit them to create a race war on that show.
Right,
exactly.
Media, right? What's it say?
Most effective devil in America.
That's so true.
Yeah.
So that's why she said. That's why Sharon was really upset about it.
She said that. I feel like
she said, I should be the one who should be crying, not you. I should be the one crying. Don't you cry.
No cultural appropriation.
Okay.
It was so bizarre. It was really, I watched some of the clips of that therapy session that they did, which, first of all, I don't understand why Cheryl Underwood came out in the beginning of the episode. And it's so artificial. She came forward at the beginning of the segment and she said, we've been on hiatus since the incident that happened. And we knew that when the show reconvened, before we could just move on, we needed to do an episode so that we could all process it in order to begin the healing. And I'm going, what kind of healing? Why does this need to be a public on-air therapy session?
I'm sick of the word. The healing, the work, safe space, safe space.
Yeah.
Healing, the work, and safe space.
Even trauma to a certain degree.
Yeah, that's a new
one. Didn't she mention during that therapy session, like she didn't want to show her upsetness at Sharon in that moment because she didn't want to be considered like the angry black woman. And I'm like, you don't really have, anybody has a right to be angry about whatever they want to be angry about, but you don't have a reason to be angry because you're arguing with your friend.
You can't really say that, Xandria, because by saying that to a black woman, you are exerting your...
No, wait, I have a quote. I have a quote from the other woman on the show because she was also traumatized.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
The other, I don't know if she's mixed or what ethnicity she is, but her name is Elaine. And they asked her, first she gave a speech acknowledging Cheryl Underwood's strength and bravery and courage for...
They have jobs.
Millionaires.
But Sharon got fired.
Sharon got fired, but it's okay because she's white, so she deserved it because she's a witch, right? She's a witch. I mean, she's a witch. If she doesn't, she drowns, and so be it. But wait, this was Elaine's quote. She said this was the problem with what Sharon said. This was why it was so hurtful, right? Just because Sharon had an opinion that they didn't agree with.
Yeah.
And Sharon's opinion wasn't even that she was attacking Meghan Markle. She was just defending her friend.
Yeah,
right?
she said she didn't agree with everything.
Elaine said, so many women identify with Meghan Markle's experience of being silenced. and not believed when she came forward with her truth. And when you deny a woman of color their truth, you are denying every woman of color.
Nobody denies me.
I will not be silenced or silent. First of all,
but this collective idea that one person
no one can deny your
every
truth or my truth, whatever that may be, because no one can deny your personal experience.
Yeah.
But to put that burden on other people and then to dissolve relationships over this false notion.
Friendship.
Yeah.
And she said, I joined this show to be able to have conversations with them,
it's an
but not to
blackmail.
be targeted. Yeah. So,
it's an emotional blackmail.
Frankly, when I was younger and I watched Suits, I didn't even know Meghan Markle was like
I've never
black.
seen
I didn't know
she was on the show.
You know what I mean?
I didn't know the show was on the show.
I saw it. Like,
You didn't know. Remember, she brought her dad on, and her dad was. And that's how I knew. I didn't know she was. Yeah, who
I didn't know.
was black?
So like, here's my thing. I didn't like think she was the best actor at the time. It's not because I
That
thought
is racist.
It's not. Yeah, right.
She-
I didn't
she
even
was
freaking
black.
know she was black.
She was
You know what I
black.
mean? So like, exactly to your point. Like Pierce just doesn't like her.
Yeah.
Everything
And it
he's
sounds
saying
like
is
he has
because he
reason.
doesn't like her.
A lot of
right?
people
and
don't like
people
her.
don't have to like her.
I've never seen the
Has
show. Don't
nothing to do
intend
with
to.
race.
Can't
It's
lie.
emotional blackmail.
That's the problem,
Yeah.
though. It's just like everything is attributed to race.
Yes.
You know? And it can have nothing to do with it. It can be something totally separate. We didn't get a chance to talk about the police shootings, but
We'll talk about it next week.
yeah, but it's
Yeah.
just like everything that happens, if it has something to do with people of
different-
opposite
yes.
Right.
races,
It's all reduced to
always
racial dynamic.
all-
And it
and
really
that-
takes away from
Go ahead.
every time that something truly is about race.
And it also
Because now
prevents
it's
us from actually giving or coming up with solutions to actual
well, that's what
problems.
I said, and that's what if we had more time, we could have spoke to Dayvon about is just getting to the root cause of this stuff, because how do you do that when everything is attributed to race? So we'll continue to, well, I guess it's it for now. Hopefully they won't drag
a lot of
this thing
follow-up
on.
discussions to be
But as far as this Cheryl Underwood thing, hopefully they won't take that.
I was
too.
gonna say one thing that did happen back with the Meghan Markle thing was after the conversation with Oprah, like a publication had put something about digital blackface.
Oh,
you know?
yeah. Right. Do you want to
Right.
explain what?
We'll talk about that next
Oh,
week.
yeah.
Would it?
No.
The murder victims.
Oh, yeah, next week?
Oh,
We'll start it next.
Oh yeah.
Let's do next so we're not rushed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
good
All right.
show tonight.
Yeah. But really quick, just to go on with that, so they were essentially saying, like, if you meme Oprah, you are being digital blackface because you are perpetuating this idea that, like, blacks are loud or emotional or, like, this and that. And it's just funny, though, because, like, every culture is different, and and what about all the white memes? What about all the Asian memes? What about all these different memes?
Well, this idea that you can only participate in or appreciate or share something if it matches your own culture or your own skin color. I mean, first of all, it reduces people. It's racial essentialism.
Yeah,
it reduces
it's
people
racist.
to their skin color, and then it says that we have to only treat other people in this regard of, like, I'm just looking at you based on your skin color. I'm just looking at you based on your skin color and interacting, as opposed to just accepting all of the dynamic differences of individuals and saying, if I like a meme, okay, Oprah is a human being. She is a person. She happens to be a woman. She happens to be black. But if there's a meme, she's one of the most powerful, rich, wealthiest women in the world. To say that a white person sharing a meme of Oprah is somehow harmful to her, it's insulting to her as a person. It is insulting to her and saying, like, you are somehow still beneath white people, that a white person can't share your meme. It's
And the
backwards
article,
thinking.
too.
It's regressive thinking.
Yeah, and the article had stated, like, it is an insult to blacks to make it sound like they're loud or this and that. And I'm thinking, like, actually, I have a lot of friends who are black that love the fact that, like, that is something they say. They're loud. Like, you're louder than me and you're louder than me. It's just a fact.
Yeah, it is. But I mean, I usually look at memes, and you're trying to invoke whatever spirit or whatever
the character
that
or the
is,
personality.
Yeah.
I
think it's
people complain. The leftist academics and the commentary, they all complain that there's not enough representation and that white people don't support black people and white people don't support, don't want to see black people on TV or don't want to see whatever. But then when people actually, there are things in our culture now, things are so different from even 10 years ago, 20 years ago, right? Like you said, there's such a greater percentage of people who are born who are multiracial, multi-ethnic, right? So there's so many more things that are just part of our mainstream American culture now. So many things that have come from traditional black culture in America that have become American culture. And to say that you cannot support or celebrate those different aspects, those collective aspects of Americana, of American culture, because you don't have the right skin color, all it does is just creates a balkanized apartheid state within the country.
Yeah.
Well, no Chinese food for me this week.
All right. Well,
I need food. I haven't eaten. I'm hungry.
I'm hungry too.
I know.
All right. Well, we have we've gone over our time, but it was a great show tonight. And again, if you are watching on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button and like our video. Again, if you're watching on Facebook, the same, share the video and like the video. And we look forward to meeting again with you next Wednesday at 8 p.m. Until then, live a life of purpose. Good night.
Good night.